In today's foray into IPDA debate, I want to start with a quick conversation about language. In this image, you see a bunch of different ways to say hello. Bonjour, hola, hi, ciao. Obviously, when we're talking about specific languages, French, English, Spanish, Italian, not speaking the language creates a disconnect and disrupts discourse. While in IPDA debate, we will be speaking English, it is important that we have a common language through which to engage in the debate. This is where the conversation about framework and what I'm going to title top of case begins. Because our goal in setting up the top of the case is to make sure everyone is on the same page with what we're debating, how we're debating it, and how a round is decided. This is arguably the most important part of a debate. A lot of the burden here falls on the affirmative, but we're going to talk a little bit about how the negative can approach it too. So we're going to talk about having a general script, what goes into the script. We're going to get a little bit into types of resolutions. We're going to have a whole different video that really gets into depth on weighing mechanisms, but we'll start with the basics on types of resolutions. And then I'm going to talk about some of the negative tips and approaches because there's things you can do, but there's things you don't necessarily want to do either. So, the first and most important thing is create a script. It doesn't need to be a verbatim word for word script, but there will be a few things that you say over and over and over, and you say in a particular order. So having a general framework or outline to work with will help you. The first thing you want on it is pleasantries. This establishes your ethos. It engages the audience with warmth cues and confidence cues. This can be very generic. Maybe you throw a joke in there, maybe you tweak it every time, right? Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Conway. Today I'm on the affirmative side of this resolution, and I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you to the judges. Thank you to my opponents. Thank you for the audience. Let's get this show on the road. Get those pleasantries out. This is an opportunity for you to create a smooth transition, show some personality, and not just be a bland debater. It also gives you a chance to show off your speaking skills, gestures, vocal inflection, pauses. Show some personality and be a human being. Get the audience to like you. They don't like you, you're behind already. So, this is a really important element, as much as it sometimes seems silly. The next thing you want to do is definitions. You'll read the resolution, right? So I stand affirmed in the resolution, all schools should go fully paperless. Okay. So we have that you're on the affirmative and we have the resolution stated. So no one's confused. If it's a virtual or in-person round, probably write it on the board if you can as well. Then you might even gesture. The resolution, all schools should go fully paperless. You want to then define each word, even if it seems a little unnecessary. Give me some sort of context if you don't want to look it up in a dictionary. But some of this is your choice. So all schools we're going to define as K through 12 in the United States. That doesn't necessarily fit all schools, right? But you can see that I'm framing the round. I'm narrowing the scope. I'm scoping it to say we're talking about K through 12 in the United States. If they challenge it, you could say, hey, like there's a lot of schools, a lot of universities, a lot of countries that do it a lot of different ways. This is a easy way that is, easily shared. If someone asks you before the round for disclosure, you might say, we're going to do K through 12 in the US. You might be able to give them that. Should implies an obligation or duty. That's a common definition that you're going to see a lot. Go, a person's turn to use or do something. I had to dig a little deeper for that one. That was actually more of a British use, according to Google. But I Googled it and found a definition that worked, and then I would cite the source. Fully means completely or totally. And then paperless, recording or relaying information by electronic media rather than paper. That's from Merriam-Webster. Cite the source if you use one. Um, don't cite Google, cite the actual one. I just didn't look it up for this particular video. And so what we can see then is the entire round is laid out. We're talking about K through 12 schools. Should means that they're obligated to, right? Go means to change or to do something or to use something completely, right? Fully. That's going to be a critical part of this round. And that's something you'll start to identify the more you do debate. That's actually a rather high threshold to say completely, fully go digital, no like middle ground. And as the negative, I can then look at that and say, hey, that's my wiggle room. I can say using both is better. Paperless recording, da 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 da. That was pretty straightforward. But even though it's pretty straightforward, I still defined all the terms because we need that common language. And if I don't define it, the negative can. And maybe they choose fully as something even higher threshold. Third, you want to define the round. So there's three types of resolutions: a fact, a value, and a policy. You want to say this is a fact round or this is a value round. Even if it's a quotation or metaphor, it's still one of these three things. So this goes back to basic persuasion theory. There's three types of persuasive statements: fact statements, value statements, and policy statements. So anyone that tries to argue we don't do that in IPDA, this isn't a debate thing. This is a persuasion theory thing. You then offer a weighing mechanism and possibly a criteria. Where one stops and one ends is a little ambiguous. There are particular parts of the country that ask for both, right? But here's an example for this particular resolution. It's a value round, right? That should obligation duty value round using the weighing mechanism of consequentialism with the criteria of education. So I then offer a summary. Whichever side has the better consequences for education ought to win the round. So I've again narrowed it to the goal of education. We're asking which produces the best consequences for education. And there's a lot of different weighing mechanisms and criteria, but that would be one for this particular resolution. All right. So that's kind of your basic script that you walk through. What are some of the different types of resolutions? That's an important question that a lot of people get confused on. Yes, they come in pints and quarts and all the different sizes. There's lots of different types of resolutions, but there's really three that you need to, the three basic types, right? Like I said a minute ago, the fact. A fact is a present tense or past tense resolution. So paper is essential for education would be a fact round. It's asking a yes or no question. Is it true or false? The affirmative has the right to define this round however they want. So they might see schools should go paperless and still define that as a fact round. I disagree. I think that's a misinterpretation of what the resolution is asking, but I understand how they get there even if I disagree. So, what you need to understand is the negative is that you're still debating future. And if they try to say we're only talking about the present, if they're saying we're going to change something and it's going to make it better, or that it's better to change it, you get to say it's better in the future not to change it. So if they're talking future, you talk future. But in its truest form, fact rounds are pre-fiat or present slash past tense. Common weighing mechanisms are going to be on balance, more true than false. So on balance, it's more true than false that paper is essential for education. I think that's a pretty biased resolution. Obviously, you can argue now technology has made it less essential. So if it says paper was essential for education, that might be then a more past tense. And then you could theoretically debate, well, it said was, we think it still is, but that doesn't mean it wasn't. Gets a little tricky with the language. But that's why the definition in language is so important, is because it sets it draws a line in the sand to know who's debating for what. So on balance, more true than false, paper is essential for education. At the end of the day, Judge, you're going to look at this like a scale, and on one side there's paper, and on the other side there's not paper, and you're going to decide if we have met the threshold for essential, it being more essential than not essential. And then there's also cost benefit analysis. Again, that's a future oriented one. If they ran, all schools should go paperless as a fact round. And then they said, on balance, more true than false. You could say, sure, Judge, I recognize the more true than false. I feel like a cost benefit analysis would be a better approach to this, right? Like, how do we decide what is more true than false? Well, we do it through a cost benefit analysis. We're asking what is better in the future um, for schools to be paperless or to not be paperless. So you can kind of explain why that is. You also have a value round. So usually this includes some sort of better, best, or comparative. I would choose this over that type of wording. Could also use the word should. So as you saw, schools should go paperless. We turned that into a value round. That was an actual debate we did. We turned that into a value round. My gut reading of it is policy, but you can run it as a value. So generally, you're talking about a hypothetical future debate about ideas or philosophy. So it's not a specific plan. It's just, we think this would be better than that. So here's another example of like that sort of topic. When in conflict, paper is better than digital. That would be a value debate. Someone would read that as a fact round because it says is and is a yes no question. I would see that. But generally, when you're comparing, you're still looking at the future. So the moment you start looking at the future, it's no longer a fact, it's a theoretical idea, and it's a comparison of ideas and philosophies, which is when this becomes a value route. When a should is present, it's often looking at a general idea of a position rather than a specific plan in a value round. But lack of specifics can be an argument against you, so be aware of that. So if in the position of schools should go fully paperless, you might be asked a question, when is this happening? And you're like, well, I don't have to put a timeline on it. That's probably fine because we're not talking about practicality. Will it work? Will it not? We're talking about, good idea, bad idea. However, if you don't define paperless, right? And then they're like, what does paperless look like? You're like, well, I don't have to define what paperless is. You do, it's in the resolution, right? And so we don't know, does this what this means? And so that leaves you looking bad and having an unclear proposal. Common weighing mechanism. I like consequentialism. You could see something like um, utilitarianism, or we'll sometimes use negative utilitarianism. But I like consequentialism. It measures an idea based on the consequences. Sometimes you attach a value. You saw me attach education. Value rounds oftentimes look at a value criterion, education, health, something like that, that's specific to the topic. But sometimes you choose a more general consequentialism and then have several values that you use throughout. Just depends on how you want to approach it. And then policy rounds. Usually it's a specific plan text with multiple elements, usually like 4 or 5 blanks. Who is doing what? How are they doing it? When are they doing it? How are they paying for it? This is like a specific rule or policy that would theoretically be passed, right? Congress passes a law, president writes an executive order, something like that. A lot of these resolutions are going to have like an actor, USFG, state of Florida should, right? And so you have an actor and an action usually implies policy. Schools should go paperless. You could argue the schools and paperless is an action and an actor. But again, the affirmative kind of has the right to define the round how they want. We make decisions to have the best debate. Some people make it to be more strategic and sort of frame people out of the round. We try not to do that. This can sometimes offer you can sometimes offer a plan text instead of the definitions. It's risky. People get confused and then try to define terms that you didn't define. Just make sure that you're like, I am offering a plan text in lieu of definitions. If the negative has questions about specific definitions and how they fit, I can offer them during cross-ex. Something like that. You should have the definition still because you need to make sure that your plan aligns with those definitions. Common weighing mechanisms, net benefit, the side with the most benefits wins. And then cost benefit analysis, weighing the costs and the benefits to decide who wins. I really like cost benefit analysis. I think that can fit in most policy or future fact resolutions. Um, I think net benefits is tricky because A, it sounds like something that's confusing for a judge that doesn't know what's going on or is new, but also you're just adding benefits as opposed to weighing the costs and the benefits. So I feel like this sets up policy around better. And that's one I recommend a lot of people use. If you are on the negative side, there's a few different strategies I want you to keep in mind. So the affirmative has the right to define the resolution however they want. They could go wild and crazy and nuts. I've seen people define resolutions so that the negative essentially is the affirmative, and then like people get really confused. Sometimes they do that because they don't know how to argue or realize they're on the wrong side or have bad arguments. I think it's lazy. But the rules give the affirmative great amount of leeway. I think they specifically say as long as it's not abusive and is debatable, which is, of course, then a debatable definition. So think about if they're harming the round, if they're harming the education, if they're harming fairness, if they're harming debatability, I think is a good way to think about it too. Like I can't debate this in good moral conscience or at all. So unless it's like egregious, don't waste too much time arguing definitions, like directly, like saying that's a bad definition. It doesn't usually win the round for the negative and wastes a lot of time. Unless that's all you have. If your definitions fit or if your arguments fit, just go with it. If your arguments are like, I'm clearly arguing against the resolution, but not against their topic, like the way they've defined it, then you can argue that. But if your arguments fit, I wouldn't really, or can be adapted slightly, I wouldn't put too much effort into arguing definitions. Um, you can adapt, modify, or clarify definitions. Obviously, they're going to be like, "Oh, it wasn't abusive." But if you're just like, "Look, I'm offering this alternative definition. Their arguments still fit. It keeps them in the round. It just makes for a more well-rounded debate that includes more things." So a lot of times, folks will be like, "We're going to use the value of education," and you're like, "Cool. I prepped all of these arguments about health, so why don't we change it to?" Overall welfare of individuals so that we can use education, which is really important, but also talk about health and all of the, life is multifaceted. We should look at it in a multifaceted lens, right? To expand it or modify it. And same goes for the weighing mechanism and criteria. If they offer on balance more true than false, you're like, look, this is a future debate. Let's use cost benefit analysis. All their arguments still work. We're just tweaking how we assess it. Like, I think that's completely reasonable and is usually by but if you're gonna have to like straight up debate which is better, think about it very carefully before you do it. Because again, you're spending a lot of time on it and you're not necessarily going to win the round unless you can prove it's abusive. There might be some judges I might be like, hey, that judge will buy it, but a lot of judges won't. They'll be like, look, AF has the right to define the round. Counter value slash criteria. In some cases, you may offer counter value. So, like when in conflict, paper is superior to digital. It might be worth emphasizing superior, right? You might have a different definition or you might use their definition. If their definition allows you to use your strategy of that's a high threshold, use their definition. But you also might put emphasis on digital because that's your position, right? So if they offer a weird definition of digital, you're like, look, we're going to use this definition of digital. This is the negatives position, right? The app has the right to define the round, but we have the right to define our own position. This is how we're going to do it. That's reasonable. If they offer education as a value, you might say personal well-being. That's the example I just gave. This looks more holistically at the individual instead of just one tenet of existence, sort of a thing. You also might consider burdens. that's a typo, can help to revisit the framework through a burdens lens, right? What is the burden of the affirmative or negative? What are they expected to do? What is the objective? So if I'm looking at cost benefit analysis, I'm like, Judge, the burden of the affirmative is to prove that the benefits of this change, and I use that language because I don't want to say policy or proposal. I just say if the benefit of this proposed change outweigh the costs, the AF wins. But the negative then must prove that the costs or harms outweigh the benefits, right? So framing that for the judge helps. And that's also why I like cost benefit analysis, because if you're on the net benefit, it's hard to be like the negative benefits doesn't make sense. So a good burden to remember as well is that the AF has the burden of upholding the resolution. I'll sometimes say at the end of the round, Judge, you are voting for or against the resolution based off the arguments presented. The burden of the affirmative is to prove the resolution true. Even if they prove all of their points, if those points don't support the resolution, you don't have the evidence to vote for the resolution. Here's one for a threshold too. Superior indicates not just more than, but highly more valuable. I made that up, but like that's how you'd read the definition. If they don't show that this threshold has been met, you can be comfortable voting for the negative. I also like that language, comfortable voting for the negative. Judges don't like being told what to do. So saying comfortable voting for is a linguistic trick. It's a warmth cue. So, quick wrap up. Scripts are very handy. Note how even on many of these examples, I had specific pre-prepared verbiage to articulate ideas on both sides. Having those in your head and basically memorized or extemporized allows you to write one or two words and then you're just reciting something you've said a lot. Okay? And maybe with some modifications. It really saves you time because you don't have to write out everything in detail. Defining and outlining everything, especially with an inexperienced judge that doesn't just know what to do. You have to explain it and outline it. That's where the burdens comes in. This is the burden of the affirmative. This is the burden of the negative. And if you're on the AF and you're thinking about a fact like threshold debate, a burden, what is my burden? What threshold do I have to achieve? Explain that clearly. Don't get tied up in rules debates on the negative, and honestly on the affirmative too. If you're like, sure, I'll take the negative, whatever. Save your time. It usually isn't worth it and prevents you from debating. Steals your time for debating, I think is what I meant. If you literally have nothing else to go for it. If it's literally going to cost you the round on the affirmative, defend it, right? You're more likely to win it on the AF than the neg. Say, hey, AF has the right to define the round. This isn't abusive. They haven't shown clear abuse. Right? Don't vote on potential abuse. It hasn't affected the round. They had clear arguments. And then if you can offer clarifications, but always note that it doesn't eliminate the AF position. It opens up a broader and more educational debate. I'm expanding the debate to make it better, but they can still do their thing and it's just fine. This is making the debate better, right? So those are some tips and tricks on top of case. Hopefully that helps you understand that. You may have to go back and kind of look at the slides and everything, but yeah, that's top of case, and I will see you in round.